Today I'm going to show you how to make this pizza peel on your table saw and router table, and I'm going to show you how to make this jig so that you can safely use your table saw to make this taper on the front. For the pizza peel, I'll be using walnut, maple, and some teak that I had left over from a previous project. Most of the pieces I started with were a little wider than 2 inches, as I wanted to make sure I had plenty of width for all of the pieces. Next, we'll take all of these pieces to the planer and get these down to the right thickness. My target thickness for the boards was 5/8 of an inch thick, but you could always go down to a 1/2 inch without having any issues. Once you have everything to the final thickness, then you can go back to the table saw and cut these to an approximate length. Whatever piece of wood you want to use for the handle in the center of the pizza peel, you want to be about 25 inches long. The main body of the pizza peel is 17 inches long, so make the side pieces 18 inches long at minimum. So I've got my pieces of the pizza peel. I took out the maple pieces, and we need this to be 14 inches wide. We've got 9 3/8. So if we take that out, we get 4.625 for the 2 pieces of maple. So each one needs to be 2 5/16. So we'll cut these down next, and we'll put them in place, and we'll get these glued up. I'm targeting an exact width of 14 inches for the pizza peel blank, but in reality you can make it 14 1/8 to 14 1/4, and we'll take off the excess later at the router table using a flush trim bit. Alright, let's put these pieces of maple in place, get an overall width, and we should be at 14 inches, and we are. So next we'll cut these side pieces to a shorter length, so the center handle piece will be sticking out, and then we'll get those glued up. Just to summarize, the piece of wood that will be the handle for the pizza peel needs to be at least 25 inches long, and the other 6 pieces that will make up the main body of the pizza peel need to be about 18 inches long. We'll remove the excess wood later using a flush trim bit at the router table. Well, now that we have all the pieces of the pizza peel rough cut, we're going to go ahead and get this glued together. Then we're going to take a 1/4 inch thick plywood, and we're going to make a template so that we can use a flush trimming bit to get an exact replica of that template without messing up this piece that we've spent a lot of time and effort putting together. For this glue up, I use Titebond 3, and one of the benefits of this glue is that it has a slightly longer open time than Titebond 1. This is definitely a point in the project where you can make a big difference by making sure you have proper alignment of all of your pieces. A little bit of time here spent making sure everything is aligned during the glue up can save you a ton of time finishing later on. And make sure if your boards slip when you're applying clamp pressure that you correct it right away before things set up. Now that the pizza peel pieces have been glued up, we're going to take this 1/4 inch sheet of plywood and we're going to make a template. Now the reason for this is so that we don't accidentally ruin the piece of wood we've already glued up. If we ruin the template, we can make another one. And if we want to make more of these down the road, we'll have a template to do it with, and we can make them much faster. So we've got a straight edge here along this side from the table saw. We're going to put another piece of wood up against it so we can put our square in place and draw something that is 90 degrees. So we've got that. We're going to extend that just a little bit. This doesn't have to be perfect, so I'm not too worried about it. So we want something that is 14 inches wide, 16 inches long, so an easy rectangle. Just move this up a little bit. Put a 14-inch mark right here. And then we'll come up 16 inches and do another 14-inch mark. Then we'll get our 16-inch mark from the bottom. So since we're not at the bottom, I like to go to an even 10 increment and come up 16 inches would be 26. We'll do the same on this edge. Now we're just going to connect all these. Now we've got 14 inches wide here, but we need the center line for the handles. We'll go over 7 inches. Put another mark up here at 7 inches. Connect those. Now this is 1.5 inches wide, so we'll go 3/4 on each side. And we'll connect those. We're also going to put a mark 1 inch up from the main part of the pizza peel, and I'll show you why in a second. Put that on each side of the handle, 1 inch up. Then we're going to actually draw a diagonal line from the corner, the outside corner, up to the mark we just made. We'll do the same on the other side. There we go, we have our basic shape for the pizza peel. We are going to use the bow we're going to make next, and we're going to put a slight curve on the end. We'll also put a slight curve in the handles at the top, and we're going to put a little radius on the top as well. So we've got a compass. I'm going to make a mark up here where I have a radius now, so I need to hold my compass where I want that radius to be, and then I'll mark this on my center line of the handle. Then I'll switch it 180 degrees, flip it around. I'll put my point in that mark I made on the center line, and then I can just draw that radius. Now next we want to put a slight curve on the handle just to give it a better look. We're going to put a slight curve on the ends here as well. We're going to make a bow out of this piece of maple that was a cutoff from our stock, and I've got some masonry string. I've drilled 2 1/8 inch diameter holes close to the end, about 1/2 inch from the end on both sides. So I'm going to take this and feed it through, and we'll just set this up so we can make some wide radius curves. So I took my ruler, and at the midpoint of the handle I put a mark 1/2 inch out on both sides of the center line, and now I'm going to take my bow and I'm going to go from the outside corners to this inside mark I just made to give the handle some curvature. I think it'll make it feel much better. And we'll do the same on the other side. And we also need to do the corners down here, but before we do those, we're going to do the bow down on the end. Now on the leading end of the pizza peel, we want a tapered end, so we don't want this curvature to be too much, because when we run it through the table saw, we would take too much off. So I'm making a mark here at 1/2 inch up on both sides, and then we'll use our bow to put our curve. That's still too steep, so we need to loosen that up a little bit. I do need to set my center line here. I have a center mark on my bow, and I want to keep that centered just so the curvature is the same on both sides or close to it. Now, the last thing we need to do is come from our handle into a radius here onto the main body. We'll do a radius on the outside as well, and we'll put radiuses down here. So we're going to go to a 3 inch, so it'll be a 1.5 inch radius. Yeah, I think that'll look a lot better. Now we're going to take this to the bandsaw, we're going to rough cut this out, then we're going to use our oscillating spindle and belt sander to clean up all the edges and get this as close to what we've drawn as possible. When rough cutting the template on the bandsaw, I like to leave about a 1/16 of an inch all the way around outside of the line. This makes it fairly easy to clean up later on the oscillating belt and spindle sander. My preference for cleaning up the template is to start with the oscillating belt sander and do all the outside edges first. Then transition to the spindle sander, and as always, you want to make sure that you use the largest diameter spindle that you can. That will help ensure that you don't put a little divot into the edge of the wood that's harder to sand out later. Just take your time, because this determines the final shape of the pizza peel. Our pizza peel blank has been setting up for a couple days, so it's time to take it out of the clamps and check it out. Looking pretty good. With the blank out of the clamps, now it's time to give this a nice sanding and make sure we have a good flat surface. At this point, everything was looking great, so we didn't need to do much in the way of extra flattening. Next, we're going to take the pizza peel template and put this over the blank, and we're going to trace this so then we can cut this out on the bandsaw. I like to leave about 1/8 of an inch or a little less around the outside line that we drew, and then we'll take this off at the router table. So now we have our template and our pizza peel blank ready to go. We're going to attach those together with some double-sided CNC tape. And then we're going to use this flush trim bit at the router table. This is a 1/2 inch diameter. It's got bearings at the top to run the template against. And then it cuts down in this first little section and up below that. So basically you're cutting towards the center of the blank on both sides, so that should eliminate any tear out. This double-sided CNC tape works fantastic for this application. I really prefer this over the blue painter's tape and CA glue, as I just find that this holds better for me and it never breaks loose. What always seems to work best for me in getting these pieces aligned is to hold one edge down on the double-sided tape just lightly and then slowly lower the other edge down into position. Once you know everything is aligned perfectly, push down firmly to attach the template to the blank. Now we're setting up the router table with a 1/2 inch collet to accept this flush trim bit. It's always a good idea to insert the router bit full depth into the collet and then pull it out just a little bit so it's not seated in the bottom. Now we can run the template and the blank around the router table and get the perfect shape for our pizza peel. Make sure not to stop in any spot too long or you could get a burn mark in the side of your board. Next we're switching out to an 1/8 inch roundover bit, and this is going to just soften up the edges on the top and bottom of the pizza peel. I'd recommend running a scrap piece of wood through the router table first to make sure you have your depth set correctly, and then run around both the top and bottom edges of the peel to make sure that you have a nice roundover on both sides. Our pizza peel is looking great. We've got the shape we want, we've got the rounded edges. We just need a bevel on the front so that as we're taking pizzas and putting them onto a baking surface, we can slide them off easier or pull them back out. Now we've got a couple problems. We can't run this through the table saw because it would rock left and right. Plus we've got this rounded edge, so it also rocks in this direction. So we'll create a jig that slides over the table saw fence and allows us to make that bevel in a safe manner. The main piece of the jig that the pizza peel will clamp to for cutting is going to be the size of the body of the pizza peel, and that's 14 by 17. I'll start out by cutting the front of the jig that the pizza peel will rest against, and then a slightly shorter piece for the back side of the jig. As I mentioned earlier, we just want the front of the jig to be about the same size as the pizza peel. This will allow us to put 2 clamps on each side of the peel and hold it against the front of the jig, and that should help hold everything in place while we're cutting the bevel. So now we have our 2 1/2 inch pieces of the jig. These are the main front and back pieces, and then we'll cut another 3/4 inch piece that will go in between, just barely wider than the fence. Both pieces will be screwed into that, and then we'll create a couple more rectangle pieces that'll go in the front and back, and then we'll have screws going into that, and that'll make it nice and rigid at 90 degrees and no chance of flexing. And then this whole thing will slide over the fence and allow us to cut the bevel on the table saw. Now we're just checking the width of the table saw fence so we can create this piece that is just barely wider than the fence itself. At the same time you cut this piece, you also want to cut the 2 smaller rectangular pieces so that they're all exactly the same width. To make it easier, you can just cut one long strip and cut the 2 rectangles off the end. Alright, here's the top piece we just cut for the fence. Feels like a pretty good fit. And we'll check this by adding our front and back pieces of the jig. Make sure this slides nicely without feeling like it's too loose. Now that the horizontal piece that sits on top of the fence is cut to the right width, we can cut the 2 rectangular pieces off the end. These will stiffen up the whole jig assembly and make it very rigid. Now I've got 2 of these little maple strips that I'm using as vertical spacers on the top of the fence. We'll put this horizontal piece in on those 2 pieces of maple, and that will keep this top piece from resting on the fence as we go through the table saw. We'll lift up our sides here, and we've got our jig mostly put together. The only other things we need to add are these horizontal blocks that will stiffen this up quite a bit. These are going in 3 inches from each end. And we'll put a 1 5/8 inch screw in from each side in the bottom of these rectangles. We'll put 3 in along this outside face into the horizontal piece, and 3 in from the outside face into the horizontal piece as well. To start the assembly, I like to mark the center point of where the horizontal piece touches both the front and back faces of the jig. Then I transfer that line to the face of both pieces and I drill some countersunk holes so that those can be screwed into the horizontal piece. Before you drill any holes and add any screws into the centerpiece, you do want to make sure that while it's clamped together, that both faces of the jig slide firmly on the table saw and that you don't have one corner that is slightly off of the surface. I had this situation at first and I had to reclamp it to make sure everything rode smoothly on the table saw. Next, we clamp the whole assembly together and we start by drilling the center hole and adding a screw in that location. Then we take the clamp off one end and we add the screws on both faces into the center horizontal piece. Now before we add the last two pieces of wood and stiffen this up, we want to make sure that the whole jig still slides nicely on the table saw over the fence. If it's not seated nicely on the table saw, you want to make sure that you adjust it at this point. Now we can add our last two pieces of wood, and these are the two little rectangles that we cut that fit in between the front and back face of the jig. I positioned these 3 inches in from the front and rear end of the jig so that the clamps could easily go around the pizza peel and hold them in place. And the final check here is to make sure that the jig is sliding nicely over the fence. Our table saw jig is nearly complete. Now when we put our pizza peel up here, we can put a couple clamps on each edge and hold it in place. But to make sure there's no movement, I'm going to take this maple offcut and I'm going to glue this along the trailing edge. That will make sure our pizza peel is at 90 degrees and there's no movement. Adding this strip of wood is very easy and there are really only two requirements. One is that you have it parallel to the edge, and the second is that the very bottom tip does not extend down past the edge that rests on the table saw surface. That would cause the jig to not ride flat on the table saw surface anymore. It's always a great idea to run a sample piece when using a new jig, so here I'm using one of the extra pieces of wood I had from the glue up to just run it through the table saw and make sure that I'm getting the right angle and leaving the right lip on the front piece of the board. That turned out great, so now we can cut the actual pizza peel. Now to cut the bevel on the actual pizza peel, we just slide it up against that edge guide and we use 2 clamps on each edge to hold the pizza peel in place. As you make this cut, I recommend using steady applied force down and into the table saw fence, and that will help take care of any little wiggle in the table saw jig itself. Now for this cut, I'm using a standard 40 tooth per inch table saw blade from SawStop, but you could go to an 80 tooth per inch cross cutting blade and that could give you a better finish on that bevel cut. Now that we have our bevel, we can move with finishing this up. One last thing we need to do is add a hole in the handle so we can hang this by a cord or on a nail. I'm using a 1/4 inch diameter brad point bit to make sure that I don't have any tear out in the top of the hole, and I'm also using a backer board on the bottom to make sure we don't blow out the bottom. To soften up the edges of this hole, I'm using a 1/16 inch radius roundover bit with a guide at the top. This allows you to get into something as small as even a 1/4 inch diameter hole and give it a nice roundover. Now we need to sand the pizza peel, and I'm going to take this up to 150 grit before we water pop the grain. The sanding pads I'm using have foam built into them, so I can easily take this over the radius edges and I don't have to worry about creating a flat spot on that radius. Now we'll water pop the grain and make sure it completely dries before we go back and sand this up to 180 grit. This is the last step before we apply the finish, so we want to make sure we have a nice uniform sanding over the entire surface. I'm using a wipe-on food grade oil finish so we don't have any safety issues. Just apply it liberally to the pizza peel, and then after about 20 to 30 minutes you can wipe off the excess. I love how this finish makes the grain and the board really pop, and I can't wait to see how this looks once we get the excess wiped off. It's time to put the pizza peel to use, and here I'm trying it out with a grilled pizza in the backyard. This is a great project to make for yourself, and even better to make for somebody else as a gift. Now it's time to get this pizza cut up and have some lunch.